Ryan, Secretary Blinken was in Israel yesterday and addressed some of the questions about the lawsuit that's been covered on this show. Tell us a little bit about what Blinken had to say when he was in Israel yesterday, facing questions actually about the genocide claims.
Yeah, he actually, so here's from his opening remarks at his press briefing yesterday, where he brings up the genocide charges that South Africa has filed. South Africa has been joined by Malaysia and Turkey at this point. France has said that they will respect the decision of the International Court of Justice, though they have not joined the prosecution yet. One, as I think was discussed on the show yesterday, one Israeli Knesset member has said, Ofer Kassif has said that he has endorsed also those genocide charges, which is fascinating development. But let's play Blinken yesterday.
We believe the submission against Israel to the International Court of Justice distracts the world from all of these important efforts. And moreover, the charge of genocide is meritless. It's particularly galling, given that those who are attacking Israel, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, as well as their supporter Iran, continue to openly call for the annihilation of Israel and the mass murder of Jews. On this trip, I came to Israel after meeting with the leaders of Turkey, Greece, Jordan, Qatar, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia. All of those leaders share our concern about the spread of the conflict. Nonetheless, 90% of Gaza's population continues to face acute food insecurity, according to the United Nations. For children, the effects of long periods without sufficient food can have lifelong consequences.
So within about a minute of saying that the charges of genocide are meritless and baseless, he adds, oh, and by the way, the United Nations says that 90% of Palestinians in Gaza are on the brink of starvation.
And the charge of genocide—
How do we square that?
So this is South Africa at the International Court of Justice, and Ryan mentioned joined by these other countries now. So one of the people who has actually argued successfully at the International Court of Justice, Francis Boyle, went on Democracy Now! And had a really interesting perspective on what could happen with this particular suit going forward, too. We have a clip of that we can roll now.
I was the first lawyer ever to win anything under the Genocide Convention from the International Court of Justice that goes back to 1921. I single-handedly won 2 world court orders for the Republic of Bosnia-Herzegovina against Yugoslavia to cease and desist from committing all acts of genocide. And based on my careful review of all the documents so far submitted by the Republic of South Africa, I believe South Africa will win an order against Israel to cease and desist from committing all acts of genocide against the Palestinians. Under Article 1 of the Genocide Convention, all contracting parties, 153 states, will then be obliged, quote, to prevent, unquote, the genocide by Israel against the Palestinians. Second, when the World Court gives this cease and desist order against Israel, the Biden administration will stand condemned under Article 3, Paragraph E of the Genocide Convention that criminalizes complicity in genocide.
And Ryan, I wonder actually if Blinken is addressing that and sort of preemptively in his scripted remarks, because as we just heard Boyle say, at least from the perspective of the ICJ, there's a case that can actually might have some legs. Yeah,
that according to Boyle, one of, who won maybe the most high-profile case before that court, they have a good South Africa has a good chance of winning this case, which then creates legal obligations, for the United States, and which then puts the United States in an even trickier position vis-a-vis the Houthis, who say that they are currently, right now, basically enacting their responsibilities and obligations under Article 1 of the Convention around the Prevention of Genocide.
Okay.
That all states have a duty to intervene to stop genocide, not just to not do genocide themselves, but if they are aware of it happening, it's their obligation to step in, and that's related to the way that the world did not step in during the Holocaust. In fact, the United States famously kind of turning away Jewish refugees fleeing the Holocaust and sending them back. And so the result was this law, this international law that says you're supposed to intervene. The Houthis say that they're operating under that pretext. If the International Court of Justice says, in fact, there is an international obligation to stop this, that makes the U.S. threats against the Houthis that much harder, I think, to sustain morally.
Completely changes that. But to sustain morally, I feel like we could have a debate on that. But to sustain even just as a member of the Security Council and a leading nation
It's embarrassing and hypocritical and all that, yeah.
But also, I would imagine there are further legal machinations that would interfere. Going forward, that you have to sort of, from the U.S. I mean, maybe if you're Blinken, you say, yeah, we can swat these down, like a fly swatter, like left and right as they come up. I don't think that's sustainable at all when you get into exactly what you're just saying with how it affects other combatants in situations.
Yeah, and not to tease the news that Ken Klippenstein is going to have later today, but that it implicates that exact question, the U.S.'s role in this war and what its legal exposure is. And related to that, and we don't have this clip enough of looking at Blinken, we can just read some of what he said at this press conference. This is all related to the humanitarian crisis that the Israeli blockade and bombardment has created. And so at the center of that, behind the scenes, is this dispute between Israel and the United Nations over how to get humanitarian aid in. Israel does not want the UN involved at all. They basically think the UN is like a cat's paw for Hamas. And so you had recently had Senators Chris Van Hal and Jeff Merkley go over to Rafah crossing, and every aid worker that you talk to says there is not enough aid getting in because of the logistical difficulties thrown up by Israel around the idea. They say it's about making sure that no weapons wind up in the hands of Hamas.
And Israel is responding to a real logistical challenge presented by Hamas, which actually, there is evidence, and there's a question of how widespread it is, but there is evidence of, for example, gunmen taking over trucks, taking the aid from the trucks, and all of that. That is a real problem for Israel.
There's a huge breakdown. There's a coming social breakdown because of the way that everything has collapsed, and you just have 2 million people living in tight quarters, and nobody getting enough food, water, or medicine.
Right.
Although even if you were able to smuggle in a couple weapons, like let's imagine that you could. Let's say the UN completely somehow failed to allow a few boxes of bullets or guns to go through. It's the most kind of well-equipped military in the world against 10,000, 20,000. How many are left? People just hold up. Is that worth starving 2 million people over? Well, and that's granting 100% of the benefit of the doubt to the Israeli argument, rather than taking a lot of the Israeli officials at their word, which is that they actually believe that the starvation policy is the goal itself, not an unfortunate byproduct, but not a bug, but a feature.
Right. No, absolutely.
And so Blinken, in his press briefing, brought up the UN, and he said, and you have kind of this is diplomacy, so you have to kind of read between the lines a little bit. But he says the United Nations is playing an indispensable role in addressing the immense humanitarian needs in Gaza. There is simply no alternative. I spoke last night with the UN's new senior humanitarian reconstruction coordinator for Gaza, Sigrid Kaag, about all these efforts that are underway. And then he says, Sigrid Kaag is someone I worked very closely with a few years ago when she led the UN mission that destroyed the Assad regime's chemical weapons in Syria. So I can say from experience, she has what it takes to get this job done. She has America's full support. She must have Israel's as well. So that Blinken very clearly, but kind of going, how would you describe that? Like kind of elliptical language. But he's saying we support the UN, and we want the UN involved in this. Yes. The UN has to be involved in this. But then he says she must have Israel's as well, meaning she doesn't yet have Israel's support. And it raises the question of what's the point of being a superpower if you have to beat around the bush and beg and cajole to get your priorities enacted? in the face of the greatest humanitarian crisis that we've seen on this planet in a very long time.
It'll be interesting to see how this transpires because, to your point earlier, and we've talked about this a lot, there's the tug of war internally within the Knesset, within Israel's own government, about how to best prosecute this war. You have some people talking about Dresden. You have some people talking about, the very real concerns of the people in Gaza, and it's difficult to know. And actually, it's difficult to know because I think it's unclear within the Netanyahu administration itself what the real policy is. Is the real policy that is the real end here that starvation is the way to prosecute the war? Is the end here that you have to sort of keep the United States happy, keep your sort of international partners happy, play nice with the UN, and you also have to, do what is morally right and ensure that innocent civilians are able to eat and drink clean water and have medical care? All of that, I think, is genuinely unclear because Israel is divided on what is the way to go forward. And so that's where the U.S. What is the point of being a superpower if you have to kind of beat around the bush?
And you can't even get your client to do what you need to do.
Will they? I mean, so what we just saw in the last month is the U.S. say, let's draw this war back. Let's sort of do an indefinite pause on the parking lot dynamics here in Gaza as the new year starts. That's exactly what happened. And so, I mean, we obviously are pulling some serious strings.
Although you're still seeing airstrikes.
Right.
I guess fewer.
They've shifted to what are they saying? Precision operations, even though they were
still hitting residential buildings and killing children. But yes,
they also had always said they were doing
Yeah.
precision too. And this goes back to how unclear the strategy of the war is. They were talking about how they were doing precision at the same time they were talking about turning Gaza into a parking lot. Precision versus parking lot. Like, this has been the theme of their stated strategy is that it's muddled.
Right. And to see how muddled it is elsewhere in the country, fascinating development reported by Axios here. You can put up this last element. So basically, Netanyahu's on a call, and the element we have up here is Ask Zelensky, UAE rebuffs Bibi request to pay Palestinian workers barred from Israel. So Netanyahu, right after October 7th, basically told West Bank Palestinian workers they could no longer travel into Israel to work anymore.
Right.
So now 150,000 or so Palestinian workers are owed unemployment benefits. Meanwhile, the right-wing elements of Netanyahu's government, well, the furthest right-wing elements, Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and others, have insisted that no money, because I think, who's the finance minister? Smotrich.
Yeah.
He's like, they're all Nazis. Everyone in Gaza is a Nazi. And they're terrorists in the West Bank, and I'm not sending them their money. So this is something that Blinken was asked about at the press briefing yesterday. This is Palestinian Authority money that is sitting in Israeli accounts that Israel has blocked from getting to the Palestinian Authority. Now, the Shin Bet and the military establishment in Israel has said this is a horrible idea. Like, set the ethics aside of whose money it is. Why are you going to create enormous economic-based instability in the West Bank? Like, at this very moment, like, this is not what we need. But Smotrich, Ben-Gvir, and others have said, if you release that money to them, we're quitting the government. We will leave. And Netanyahu apparently believes that he can't keep together a coalition without the far right. So what does he do? He calls up Mohammed bin Zayed over at the UAE. He's like, yeah, they've got money over it. Right. The Emiratis got money. And bin Zayed was so appalled by the request that they leaked it to the press. And so Netanyahu said, hey, can you pay the unemployment benefits of these Palestinian workers that I'm barring from Israel? And he's like, are you joking?
Right.
And to show how ridiculous he thought the request was, he said, why don't you go ask Zelensky?
Ask Zelensky.
Zelensky's gotten a lot of money from your friends lately. He's got a lot sitting around. Go ask him for some money if you've got a problem. Or give the Palestinians their money. Or let them work. Like, what's your long-term strategy here? Like, the way that Gaza turned into the complete economic basket case that it's been for the last 2 decades is not because of, say Hamas decided to turn it into some terror den. It's because Gazans were no longer allowed to leave, and the entire economy was based on exchange with the rest of Israel. And so what's left then, well, just guess we're going to fight.
Negotiating with, again, this is where Netanyahu is in a serious jam when it comes to not an unpredictable one, and he knew that all along. I mean, if this ever happened, they understood exactly what kind of problems they would be facing, and this is obviously one of them. When you're looking at the same dynamics we just talked about with the UN when it comes to this money, that in order for him to maintain his coalition, he has to keep Smotrich, Ben-Gvir happy, and to keep them happy, you have to piss a lot of other people off. And you have to...
Including all these people you owe money to.
Including that and including the United States. And so, again, none of this is like simple. It's obviously extremely complicated, both strategically and politically. Morally is the other question. And, when you kind of I think there's a benefit in some sense of being here in the United States. You can sort of see things in a way that's not even just the United States. I mean, if you're outside of the war zone, you have the benefit of, for example, some clarity, additional clarity that you don't necessarily always have. That doesn't mean we know better. That's not what I'm saying at all. What I'm saying is that you're at least able to take a step back and emotionally see that there's a real moral problem for everyone.
And to the extent it's complicated from Netanyahu's perspective of trying to stay in power in an untenable situation.
But I mean, genuinely
he's got the world held hostage in a way because, if he leaves office, he might go to jail because of these previous corruption charges.
Yeah.
So he's just doing any dance that he can and doing anything to stay in power.
And also,
which is, I feel like the rest of the world should be like, okay, fine, we won't prosecute you for these corruption charges if you will just rationally come to some end of this. Now, I think a lot of the world would like to see him prosecuted for war crimes, so that's complicated. But having all of this held hostage by his corruption charges from the past, it just makes it that much more difficult to then sort through the question of what coalition ought to be running the government.
Also, it is a complicated question when it comes to whether or not you're, by helping civilians, you're arming your enemy. And to some extent, you absolutely are helping your enemy when you are taking care of civilians. But that's something that after World War II, we kind of came to the table and said, there's a serious give and take here that needs to, here's how we've sort of mapped this out morally, legally. And that's, I'm not saying that's easy, at least. That's genuinely a very complicated moral question. But again, we can see pretty clearly what's happened to civilians in Gaza.
But the dynamic can be the reverse in a way, and that's why the national security establishment wants these Palestinians to get paid. Because actually by not paying them, you're making life much more difficult for the Israeli national security establishment, which does not want a gigantic uprising in the West Bank right now.
Yeah.
They'll take it some other times, perhaps, and when they can focus all of their energies on suppressing it. But when they're trying to pick a fight with Iran, with Hezbollah, and engaged in this like wholesale slaughter down in Gaza, to have millions of Palestinians in the West Bank livid is just bad timing.
Absolutely.
But the ideologues in that government are like, we don't care. Like they're just going for it.
Right. Well, and their goals are certainly different than our goals. We talked about this last week. Netanyahu, no two-state solution. President Biden, who is in the United States in general, who are a huge part of this war in terms of munitions. About 20% of the Israeli military budget comes to the United States every year. Say two-state solution. Not a minor difference. It's a huge, huge difference, and it's one that continues, obviously, to plague the prosecution of the war from our perspective, from Israel's perspective. If you're not on the same page about some of these very basic end goals, like Netanyahu is not with Smotrich and Ben-Gvir, huge problems.
Hey, if you liked that video, don't forget to hit the like button and subscribe to Breaking Points.
If you want to see the rest of Counterpoints, go to breakingpoints.com to become a premium member and get the full uncut show every morning in your inbox and on Spotify.
Help us build independent news and get the full show every morning at breakingpoints.com.